What if the loneliness you're feeling right now is not abandonment at all? What if it's actually a setup for something you're not ready to understand yet? Because sometimes life doesn't remove people to punish you. It removes them so you stop seeking noise and finally hear direction. And that changes everything. If you've been feeling left behind, misunderstood, or like everyone is moving ahead while you're stuck in silence, don't scroll. Because what you're calling a breakdown might actually be a quiet initiation into your next level. And most people miss it because it doesn't look powerful at first. It looks lonely. The idea that chosen one moments often feel isolating before they feel powerful is rooted in how human growth actually works psychologically, not in any mystical labeling. When a person begins to change at a deeper level, emotionally, mentally, or behaviorally, they almost always outgrow the environment that once felt normal. This doesn't happen suddenly in a dramatic way. It happens through subtle shifts in perception, priorities, and emotional tolerance. You stop finding comfort in conversations that used to entertain you. You start questioning patterns you once accepted without thought. And because your internal world is shifting faster than your external environment, there is a mismatch that creates a strong sense of isolation. The brain is wired for familiarity. Even when something is unhealthy or limiting, it can still feel safer than uncertainty. So, when you begin to evolve, your old attachments, routines, and social validations stop matching your new internal state. That mismatch creates emotional distance, not necessarily because people are leaving you, but because you are no longer resonating with the same frequency of connection. This is often misunderstood as rejection, but psychologically it is more accurate to call it disalignment. During this phase, the mind also goes through a withdrawal-like process. External validation used to regulate your emotional stability, messages, approval, attention, shared experiences. When those inputs reduce or feel less meaningful, the nervous system initially interprets it as loss. That is why the early stage of growth can feel like loneliness rather than empowerment. You are still adapting to a new way of being without relying on the old emotional scaffolding that once supported your identity. Another layer to this experience is increased self-awareness. As introspection deepens, you become more sensitive to inauthenticity, both in others and in yourself. Conversations feel thinner, distractions feel louder, and surface-level interactions feel draining. This heightened awareness reduces the number of situations where you feel truly connected, which intensifies the feeling of isolation even further. But what is actually happening underneath is refinement. Your internal system is reorganizing itself around a different standard of emotional truth. That process requires temporary solitude because too much external input would interfere with it. In psychological terms, this is a reorganization phase where identity structures are being updated, and during updates, old systems naturally disconnect before new ones stabilize. The idea that silence is sometimes not rejection but protection and preparation becomes clearer when you understand how emotional and psychological development actually unfolds. Human beings tend to interpret silence through an attachment lens first. If someone pulls away, stops responding, or life suddenly becomes quieter, the immediate emotional assumption is abandonment. The nervous system reads reduced engagement as loss of connection, and that triggers anxiety, overthinking, and attempts to restore what feels missing. But not all silence is caused by external withdrawal. Sometimes it is created by internal restructuring. There are phases in personal growth where continued emotional stimulation, old relationships, or familiar environments would actually interfere with necessary internal changes. In those moments, life appears to slow down externally, but internally, a great deal is being reorganized. The mind is trying to detach from old patterns of thinking, reacting, and attaching. That detachment process requires reduced noise because constant emotional input keeps you anchored to previous versions of yourself. So the silence becomes a kind of buffer zone where your system can recalibrate without interruption. From a psychological perspective, this can be understood as a reduction in external reinforcement loops. Normally, identity is reinforced through feedback, approval, response, validation, or even conflict. When that reinforcement decreases, it feels like emptiness at first. But that emptiness is not necessarily absence. It is space. Space for re-evaluation, space for emotional reset, and space for new behavioral patterns to form without being overridden by old conditioning. Silence also plays a protective role by naturally distancing you from environments or dynamics that no longer align with your growth trajectory. If certain relationships or situations continued during a sensitive phase of change, they could pull you back into familiar emotional responses. The lack of engagement prevents that regression. In that sense, what feels like disconnection is actually a form of boundary creation that is not consciously controlled but developmentally necessary. Preparation is another layer of this process. When external life becomes quieter, internal perception becomes sharper. You begin noticing patterns, emotional triggers, and personal truths that were previously ignored. This heightened awareness is uncomfortable because it removes distraction, but it is also foundational for long-term stability. Without silence, this level of clarity rarely emerges because the mind is too occupied reacting to external input to reflect deeply. So what appears as being left behind or cut off is often a transitional phase where life is intentionally reducing noise so that something more stable, more self-directed, and more aligned can form without distortion from the past. When emotional discomfort begins to rise during periods of change, most people immediately interpret it as a warning sign that something is going wrong. The natural response is to resist it, fix it, or escape from it as quickly as possible. But in psychological terms, discomfort is not always a signal of damage. It is often a signal of adaptation. The mind and nervous system are built around patterns, and whenever those patterns are disrupted, discomfort is the first language the system uses to indicate that something familiar is no longer fully functioning in the same way. This becomes especially intense during periods of internal growth. As a person starts to shift their beliefs, boundaries, or emotional responses, their old coping mechanisms no longer fit as smoothly as they once did. Situations that used to feel manageable may suddenly feel overwhelming, not because they have changed externally, but because the internal framework used to interpret them is changing. That mismatch creates emotional tension, and that tension is often experienced as confusion, anxiety, or heaviness. What makes this even more challenging is that the human brain is prediction-based. It prefers environments where outcomes feel familiar and predictable, even if those environments are not ideal. When growth begins to introduce unpredictability, new reactions, new thoughts, new emotional boundaries, the brain registers it as instability. That is why discomfort often peaks right before a breakthrough in behavior or awareness. The system is adjusting its predictions, and during that adjustment period, things feel uncertain and emotionally unsteady. Another important aspect is that discomfort forces awareness. When things feel easy and automatic, people rarely reflect deeply on their internal state. But when discomfort appears, it interrupts autopilot functioning. It makes you notice what you are tolerating, what you are suppressing, and what you are outgrowing. In that sense, discomfort is not just an emotional experience, It is an attention mechanism. It pulls consciousness toward areas that require integration or change. The resistance to discomfort is also tied to identity stability. Letting go of old emotional patterns can feel like losing part of who you are, even if those patterns were limiting. The mind often confuses familiarity with safety, so even outdated emotional responses can feel more secure than unknown ones. This is why people often return to old habits, relationships, or thought cycles, not because they are better, but because they are predictable. However, when discomfort is observed rather than immediately resisted, it begins to change function. Instead of being a signal of threat, it becomes a signal of transition. It indicates that the internal system is actively reorganizing itself toward a new level of stability. What feels like emotional instability is often the middle stage between an old way of being and a more expanded one that has not fully settled yet. Not everyone can witness your growth without misunderstanding it, because people don't just see you as you are in the present moment. They also unconsciously interpret you through the version of you they already know. Human perception is deeply anchored in memory, familiarity, and expectation. So when someone begins to change internally, those closest to them often continue responding to an outdated emotional image rather than the current reality. This creates a gap between who you are becoming and how you are being perceived. When growth is subtle, it can go unnoticed for a while, but when it becomes noticeable, changes in boundaries, communication style, emotional responses, or priorities, it can disrupt the balance others are used to. People around you often build an internal reference point of who you are, and that reference point provides them with emotional predictability. When your behavior no longer matches that internal model, it can create confusion, discomfort, or even resistance in them. Not because your growth is wrong, but because it breaks their expectation of stability. Misunderstanding often arises from projection. People tend to interpret change through their own emotional framework. If they are used to you being available, quiet growth might look like emotional distance. If they are used to you being expressive, calmness might look like disinterest. If they are used to you accommodating others, boundaries might look like rejection. The same change can be interpreted in multiple distorted ways, depending on the observer's emotional conditioning. Another layer is that your growth can unconsciously trigger insecurities in others. When someone changes in a way that suggests self-awareness, emotional independence, or stronger boundaries, it can highlight areas where others feel stagnant or uncertain about their own development. This doesn't always lead to hostility, but it can lead to subtle withdrawal, criticism, or misunderstanding because your change disrupts their internal equilibrium. There is also a psychological resistance to rewriting narratives. People prefer consistency in how they understand others because it reduces cognitive effort. Accepting that someone has changed requires updating emotional memory, which takes mental and emotional energy. So instead of adjusting their perception, many default to the older, simpler version of you they already understand. This is why growth can feel isolating, even in the presence of people. You are no longer being fully met where you are, but instead being interacted with through a version of you that no longer exists internally. That mismatch creates a quiet form of loneliness, not because connection is absent, but because recognition is incomplete. Delays in life are not denials. They are alignment processes that unfold when your internal readiness and external circumstances are not yet synchronized. From a psychological perspective, humans often interpret delay through urgency and comparison. When something doesn't happen on time according to expectation, the mind immediately labels it as failure or rejection. But timing in life is rarely about punishment. It is more often about development, preparation, and structural readiness that is not immediately visible. Internally, a delay often gives space for emotional maturation. You may want an opportunity, relationship, or outcome, but your nervous system might still be learning how to handle the responsibility or emotional intensity that comes with it. Without that internal stability, even receiving what you want could create long-term instability or dissatisfaction. So the delay acts as a stabilizing phase, where your reactions, beliefs, and coping patterns are quietly being refined. There is also a cognitive aspect to this. The mind builds expectations based on incomplete information. It assumes readiness based on desire, but readiness is actually a combination of skill, emotional regulation, timing, and environmental conditions. When one of these components is not aligned, delay becomes a natural correction rather than a blockage. It is the system preventing premature outcomes that could collapse under pressure. Another important layer is identity formation. During periods of waiting, individuals often undergo subtle identity shifts. You begin to question what you truly value versus what you thought you wanted under pressure or influence. This reflective space strips away impulsive desire and replaces it with clarity. Without delay, many people would move into situations they are not psychologically prepared to sustain, leading to burnout, dissatisfaction, or emotional regression. Externally, delays also help filter distractions. Not every opportunity or path that appears desirable is actually aligned with your long-term direction. When things don't happen immediately, it forces you to slow down and reassess what is truly necessary versus what is simply emotionally appealing in the moment. This reduction in speed often leads to better discernment and stronger long-term outcomes. There is also a protective function. Sometimes what is delayed is not fully safe or stable in its current form. The delay allows unseen variables to settle. People change, circumstances shift, and new information emerges. What feels like stagnation is often unseen restructuring in the background that ensures you don't step into something prematurely. So rather than being a signal of absence or rejection, delay is often a recalibration of timing, identity, and readiness. It is the system ensuring that when something finally arrives, you are not just able to receive it, but able to sustain and grow with it without losing yourself in the process. Inner strength is not something that appears when life becomes easy or when external validation is consistently available. In fact, it develops most deeply in the absence of those supports. When a person is constantly receiving reassurance from others through approval, attention, encouragement, or predictable outcomes, the emotional system becomes externally regulated. Stability feels like something that comes from outside, not from within. But when that external reinforcement reduces or disappears, the mind is forced to reorganize how it maintains balance. This is where inner strength begins to form. Without constant feedback from the environment, a person has to rely more on internal interpretation rather than external confirmation. That shift is uncomfortable at first because the brain is wired to seek social validation as a safety mechanism. However, over time, the absence of external validation forces the development of self-referential stability, meaning your sense of direction, worth, and emotional grounding starts to come from internal consistency rather than external reaction. Psychologically, this process strengthens emotional regulation. Instead of reacting based on how others respond to you, you begin to observe your own thoughts, feelings, and decisions more independently. You learn to sit with uncertainty without immediately seeking reassurance. This increases tolerance for discomfort and reduces emotional dependency on external approval. What once felt like instability gradually becomes resilience. Another key aspect is the restructuring of identity. When validation is constant, identity can become fragmented because it shifts depending on who is responding to you. You may behave differently to gain acceptance in different environments. But when external validation fades, those fragmented versions begin to consolidate. You start asking what feels consistent within you rather than what is rewarded externally. That consolidation is where authenticity begins to form. The absence of validation also exposes emotional patterns that were previously masked. Without distraction, you become more aware of your triggers, insecurities, and automatic reactions. While this can feel uncomfortable, it is essential for strengthening emotional awareness. You cannot build real inner stability without first seeing where instability exists. Over time, this internal reliance creates a different kind of confidence. It is not loud or dependent on external approval. It is quieter, more grounded, and less reactive. You begin to trust your own judgment, even when it is not immediately validated by others. This does not mean isolation from the world, but rather reduced dependency on it for emotional stability. So inner strength is not created by constant support, but by learning to remain steady when that support is inconsistent or absent. It is built in the space where external noise fades and internal clarity begins to take its place. A sense of spiritual or psychological awakening often feels like being cut off because it involves a gradual separation from familiar emotional structures that once gave life predictability. When people go through deep internal shifts, what changes first is not the external world, but the way the mind interprets it. Old patterns of thinking, reacting, and attaching start to lose their automatic control. This creates an internal gap where the familiar no longer fully fits, but the new sense of self has not yet fully stabilized. That gap is experienced as disconnection. From a psychological standpoint, this is a restructuring of identity. The mind builds identity through repetition, thought patterns, emotional responses, relationships, and roles. When those patterns begin to dissolve or weaken, the brain initially registers it as loss because it is removing systems it once relied on for emotional safety. Even if those systems were limiting, they were still predictable, and predictability is often confused with security. During this phase, people often feel detached from their surroundings, as if they are observing life rather than fully participating in it. This is not necessarily emotional numbness, but rather a shift in perception. The mind becomes more reflective and less reactive. External events that once triggered strong emotional responses may start to feel distant or less influential. This change can create the impression of being cut off, when in reality the sensitivity to old stimuli is decreasing. Another layer is the reduction of external emotional dependency. As awareness increases, there is often a natural withdrawal from environments, conversations, or relationships that operate on surface-level engagement. This is not always a conscious decision. It happens because the internal system no longer finds the same level of resonance in those interactions. As a result, social connections may temporarily feel weaker or less meaningful, which intensifies the feeling of isolation. At the same time, internal processing becomes much more active. The mind begins re-evaluating beliefs, past experiences, and emotional conditioning without constant external distraction. This inward focus can feel like separation from the world, but it is actually a reorientation toward internal coherence. The system is prioritizing internal clarity over external stimulation. What makes this experience particularly intense is that it often lacks immediate external confirmation. There is no clear sign that something meaningful is happening. From the outside, Life may look paused or quiet, while internally significant restructuring is underway. This mismatch between internal change and external appearance is what creates the sensation of being disconnected or cut off. Over time, as this restructuring stabilizes, the feeling of separation reduces. What initially felt like isolation gradually transforms into a more grounded sense of self that is less dependent on external validation for emotional stability or identity definition. The idea that the real shift begins when you stop chasing explanation and start trusting timing reflects a deeper psychological transition from control-based thinking to acceptance-based awareness. Most people try to regulate uncertainty by constantly seeking answers. Why something happened, when it will change, what it means, or how to fix it immediately. This need for explanation creates a sense of control, even when actual control is limited. It gives the mind something to hold on to when reality feels unpredictable. However, during periods of growth or emotional transition, not everything can be understood in real time. The mind often demands clarity before readiness has developed, but clarity is sometimes a result of experience rather than a prerequisite for it. When someone keeps chasing explanations in an unstable phase, they can unintentionally increase anxiety, because every partial answer leads to more questions. This creates a loop where understanding is constantly pursued but never fully stabilizing. Trusting timing introduces a different internal approach. Instead of forcing immediate interpretation, it allows experiences to unfold without constant cognitive interruption. Psychologically, this reduces mental overload and creates space for patterns to reveal themselves naturally. Many situations only become clear in hindsight because emotional distance is required to see structure, cause, and meaning without distortion from immediate feelings. This shift also changes the relationship with uncertainty. Instead of seeing uncertainty as a problem that must be solved immediately, it becomes a state that can be tolerated. This tolerance is not passive resignation, it is emotional regulation. It allows the nervous system to remain steadier even when outcomes are not yet defined. Over time, this reduces impulsive reactions driven by fear or urgency. There is also a developmental aspect to this process. People often seek explanations because they want to move faster through discomfort. But certain emotional and psychological changes cannot be accelerated simply by understanding them intellectually. They require time to integrate at a deeper level. Trusting timing acknowledges that integration has its own pace, and forcing it can actually delay stability rather than create it. As this shift develops, individuals often notice a reduction in internal noise. Instead of constantly analyzing every detail, there is more space for observation without immediate judgment. This creates a calmer internal environment where experiences are not constantly being overinterpreted. Decisions become less reactive and more grounded in actual readiness rather than emotional urgency. Ultimately, the transition from chasing explanation to trusting timing is a move from mental overprocessing to experiential understanding. It allows life events to unfold, settle, and reveal meaning naturally, rather than forcing premature conclusions that may not fully match reality. What all of this ultimately comes down to is a shift in how you interpret your own experience. What once looked like abandonment, delay, silence, or emotional discomfort starts to reveal itself as a deeper process of restructuring rather than punishment. The moments that felt like being left behind begin to make sense as periods where life reduced noise so you could hear yourself more clearly. The confusion that once demanded immediate answers slowly transforms into understanding that not everything is meant to be decoded in real time.